Okay, so today we're going deep on something you've definitely experienced.
Sure.
Port seating. I mean,
Yeah.
you're there, you've got your bags, you're just looking for a place to kind of park it.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
there's actually a lot more to it than just picking a random seat, and we're diving into a fascinating study from Taipei Songshan Airport to explore that.
Yeah, and thinking about it, when you're in that waiting area, you walk in, bags in tow, and you're looking for that spot, and you might even have a favorite spot. This study really pulls back the curtain on what drives those decisions in that seemingly kind of mundane aspect of travel.
Yeah, and that's really what we're doing today, digging into these super interesting findings about how people choose their airport seats, how luggage plays a role, and how the design of the seating area itself can actually influence our choices.
Yeah.
It's way more than just a seat. We're looking at a whole network of factors here.
Mhm.
The amount of luggage, the size, if you're solo or with people, needing a bit of space, even wanting to see if your flight's on time. And the researchers didn't just observe, they also asked travelers about their preferences and even went as far as to rearrange the seating to see how that changed things.
Yeah, which is really, really interesting.
So let's jump into it.
Absolutely.
First, tell us about that initial observation phase. I mean, they were really thorough, right?
Yeah, this wasn't just a quick look-see. We're talking about a full 12 hours of observation across 3 different zones of the airport. They labeled those zones A, B, and C, and every hour they meticulously recorded what people were doing, who they were with, their luggage, how crowded it was. Each zone had its own unique layout, which we'll get into, and that really played a role in the findings. So much good stuff here.
Okay, let's start with Zone A. What were some of the key observations there?
So Zone A, this was the area where, first row and aisle seats were the hot commodities.
Yeah.
And one thing that really jumped out was that even though they had designated seating available, people were clearly prioritizing that ease of movement and having immediate space for their luggage. They even documented people, I mean, you can see in the photos, like actually putting their bags in the aisles, especially in front of that first row, almost as if that need for close proximity and easy access to their bags trumped, keeping the walkways clear. And another interesting thing was if people were sitting with companions, in those inner seats, they often didn't even bother to keep their luggage right next to them. It's like there was this unspoken understanding within the travel group about who was managing the bags.
Interesting. Yeah, you're right. I hadn't really thought about that.
It's fascinating.
The Zone B, now that was a different story, right? Much more densely packed.
Exactly. Zone B had a much denser arrangement of seats. And so the first row, again, was popular, and also the seats right on the edges along the sides because they didn't have that central aisle running through it like in Zone A. People adapted, right, and tended to put their luggage along the sides of the seating area. In fact, they even pinpoint specific seat numbers, seat 17, 23, and 34, as like luggage hotspots, and seat number 19 was occupied more than any other. So clearly the layout of the space was impacting how people managed their bags.
So how did Zone C play into all this? Remember that was up on the second floor after check-in.
Yeah, so Zone C was a bit of a different vibe because you've already checked your bags. People had less luggage with them generally and usually just kept their bags near their seats. And if they had multiple bags, they tended to arrange them neatly, which was interesting. Overall, the usage in Zone C was pretty average, but what really stood out there was how much people valued privacy. Those corner seats that were kind of more towards the center and had a view down to the check-in area, those were the prime real estate. Those were the ones people were gravitating towards. And the researchers noted that those were also larger seats. So it seems like once luggage wasn't the main driver, it became more about personal space and having kind of a good vantage point within the airport environment.
So even when the airport was pretty empty, those same preferences kind of held true.
Yeah, absolutely. Even when they observed the seating areas with less than a third of the seats occupied, and it's pretty quiet, those preferences still shone through. Zone A, first row with companions, still popular. Zone B, first row specifically seats 22, 23, and 24, and sometimes the side seats were taken. The middle was largely avoided. Zone C, central private corner seats, still the favorites. So this really suggests that these aren't just choices of convenience in a crowded space. They actually reflect those deeper preferences about ease of access, luggage management, and that need for personal space or, a good view.
And they put some numbers to this too, right? They looked at the ratio of users per seat and luggage per seat. What did that tell them?
Yeah, so they had those formulas, which is, it gives us more quantifiable data. And it's interesting to see Zone A actually had a higher number of users per seat overall, which suggests it was just generally a more popular area. But Zone B had more luggage items per seat, and they theorized that the central aisle in Zone A allowed people to, move around more freely and keep their luggage with them, whereas Zone B, without that aisle, people had to place their bags in front of them and kind of stake their claim, which might have led to this, higher concentration of bags right in the seating area. Zone C, being post check-in, had the lowest luggage per seat, and those comfy sofas, they were used more often than the standard seats in A and B. So it really just shows how layout can impact usage and luggage behavior.
Okay, so they also did this really interesting continuous recording of a smaller group of travelers,
Yeah.
40 people, I believe.
Yeah.
What did they learn from that?
So this is where they get that much richer, more nuanced understanding of how people are using the space. And with couples in zones A and B, they often observed this kind of tag teaming where one person would stay with the luggage while the other maybe explored or got food. They even saw people using empty seats to spread out and like repack their bags, which I'm sure a lot of our listeners can relate to.
Definitely.
Parents with children tended to have shorter stays in the seating areas. Settle travelers with luggage often use the seat briefly to do something specific, like, get out a laptop or rearrange their stuff. And they almost always kept their luggage right next to them. And it was kind of funny, they noted that even travelers in suits would sometimes just use the seating area for like a quick repack without even sitting down fully. It's like these little logistical puzzles that people are solving on the fly.
Right, right. And what about people waiting for someone else?
So people waiting for companions, they often had longer stays, and if they weren't comfortable, they would kind of shift around sometimes, even using extra seats to create more space for themselves. Larger groups almost established a little territory, arranging their bags and talking, and older members sometimes stayed seated for longer periods.
And Zone C, again, just had its own distinct vibe.
Totally. In Zone C, we saw more social interaction, groups sometimes forming circles to eat, couples taking photos with that, flight schedule board in the background,
Yeah.
kind of capturing that pre-flight moment.
Hmm.
Kids moving around more freely, and individuals were more likely to be reading comfortably. Larger groups in Zone C even used their luggage as markers to define their space, and people seemed more inclined to change their posture, suggesting, a longer, more relaxed wait.
So some general observations that you pull out from this continuous recording?
Yeah, so a couple key things jumped out. Single travelers in zones A and B often found the high back seats less comfortable for long rests, and they would use their hand behind their head for support. The sofas in Zone C were definitely preferred for things like reading or using devices. Privacy was huge for solo travelers, choosing seats away from others and using their luggage as a buffer. In Zones A and B, travelers with baggage often favored those aisle seats because it made it easier to repack things like gifts, take off jackets, that kind of thing. When it was quieter, single travelers would even use extra seats for their luggage. Groups tended to claim a whole section, using bags to define their space and facilitate conversation. They'd maintain a presence even if some members left temporarily. Posture really depended on what people were doing, more upright for eating or talking, leaning back to rest. It seemed like zones A and B were more for shorter stays, sometimes just for repacking, while Zone C's sofas were better for longer waits. And that visibility of the flight schedule in Zone C seemed to contribute to people's comfort.
It is amazing how much is going on, like in our heads when we're in these spaces and we don't even realize it. Okay, so after all this observation, they moved on to surveying travelers.
Right.
What were they looking to learn from that?
So they surveyed 200 travelers in the airport to get their direct input on why they were using those seating areas, what they valued in airport seating, and what they thought could be improved. It was a good way to complement the observations, with the travelers' actual thoughts and opinions.
And what were the main reasons people gave for being in those seating areas?
The top reason was simply resting or waiting, which makes sense, at 21.5%. Shopping was a big one too, almost 20%. And then chatting with travel companions came in third at about 15.4%.
Okay, and when it came to the seats themselves, what features were most desired?
Space for luggage was the number one thing people wanted, at 26%. Being close to the boarding gates was also a high priority at 23%, and then having a good view came in at 16%.
Okay, so practical stuff, but also, like you said, just the environment matters.
Yeah.
What about improvements? What did people want to see?
More privacy was a big one. 15% of the respondents said that. Even more important to a lot of people was the ability to see the flight schedules more easily from their seats. Almost a quarter of people mentioned that. And then 17% said they wanted it to be easier to talk to companions who might be sitting in other seats, highlighting that social aspect of travel.
Yeah, interesting. What were the reasons that people gave for choosing a specific seating area?
Reclining seats were a big draw, 28%. Again, luggage space, crucial factor, 25%. And good views also played a role, 15%. So comfort and practicality seemed to be the key drivers.
And finally, what were their expectations for the design of airport seating?
Seats that they could lie back on was a top expectation, 18%. Luggage space, again, very important, 15%, as well as comfortable materials, also 15%, and seats that were suitable for longer periods, 12%.
So comfort, being able to rest, really key design considerations for people. It's clear from the survey that luggage, comfort, access to information, and even the ability to socialize play a huge role in how we experience those airport seating areas. But this is the cool part. They took all this information and actually rearranged the seats in zones A, B, and C. So tell us about that post-occupancy evaluation, the POE, and what happened after they made those changes.
Yeah, this is the really cool part, where they get to put those findings into action.
Yeah.
So they basically used that more spacious layout of the original Zone A as a model to kind of combine zones A and B. And then in Zone C, they tried a more symmetrical arrangement of seating to see if it would make the flow of people smoother. And after making these changes, they observed another 495 travelers over a 12-hour period to see how those new layouts were being used.
So what were the immediate impacts of those changes?
So in that new combined Zone A, even though they had more seats overall and the luggage placement seemed a bit more spread out, that issue of luggage obstructing the aisles, it persisted. In the rearranged Zone C, they did see a more even initial usage of the seats. But kind of surprisingly, certain seats, numbers 35 and 36, they became consistently unoccupied. They think that's because the new arrangement actually ended up blocking the flow of foot traffic.
Unintended consequences.
Right.
Happens all the time.
Right.
What about during those less busy periods after the rearrangement? Same deal. Did people stick to their preferences?
Yeah, even with lower occupancy in that new Zone A, almost every seat was used at least once, and the first row remained the most popular. Luggage was being placed more along the sides, which was an improvement. In Zone C, the upper row of seats now faced the food court, and people sitting there tended to face inwards towards the center of the seating area. Seats 01 through 34 were occupied more often, so it suggests that proximity to amenities, the food court, and the orientation of the seating itself also play a role.
And what about those utilization rate numbers after they made the changes?
So in Zone A, the utilization rate actually decreased, which means fewer seats were occupied on average, but the number of luggage items present actually increased. In Zone C, the average number of users per seat stayed about the same, but the number of luggage items per seat also went up. So it seems like the rearrangement, while it may have provided more perceived luggage space, it didn't necessarily lead to more efficient use of the seating overall.
Okay, so tons of data from observations, surveys, and testing out changes. What are the big takeaways from all this?
So one big finding was actually confirming earlier research, a 2002 study by NE, which found that people tend to prefer side seats, corner seats, and seats with armrests. And this study definitely backed that up. They also found that Zone A, even before they combined it with Zone B, had a higher utilization rate, probably because of that central aisle compared to that more densely packed Zone B. That need for privacy as a driver and seating choice, that was strongly supported too, especially by the popularity of those particular seats in Zone C. And wanting a good view, that consistently came up as a factor.
Did their findings match up with what travelers said in the survey?
Yeah, pretty well. The need for rest, wanting space for luggage, being close to the boarding gates, having a good view, these all consistently came up in both the observational data and the survey responses.
And what about that ideal scenario they talked about regarding luggage?
Yeah, so from a design standpoint, they said the ideal would be a situation where there's roughly one piece of luggage per seat. And the rearrangement was partly aimed at, moving towards that, giving people more space for their bags. However, what they found was that it actually seemed to encourage people to bring even more luggage into those seating areas, which, sometimes made the aisle blockage worse and could even lead to more territorial behavior around seating.
So even though they were trying to make it better with that central aisle in the combined Zone A, it still wasn't wide enough.
Exactly. While that aisle did provide access, its width wasn't enough to handle luggage being placed there without getting in the way of people moving through the space. And that increase in luggage after the rearrangement suggests that while people might have felt like they had more space, ultimately it didn't solve that ongoing problem of blocked aisles.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. Listener, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the seemingly simple world of airport seating?
I mean, first of all, it's clear that luggage is a huge factor in how we choose where to sit in an airport. We want space for it. We want to be able to manage it easily. Second, aisles are absolutely essential, not just for moving around, but ideally for accommodating luggage. But the width of those aisles is critical. Third, we really value privacy and having a nice view. That significantly influences what seats we find most desirable. Fourth, traveler behavior is all over the place. Solo travelers have different needs than groups, people with short layovers versus long layovers, so seating designs really need to be flexible. And finally, while symmetrical arrangements can potentially improve how evenly a space is used, they have to be carefully considered so you don't accidentally create new obstacles for people moving through the space.
It is fascinating to think about how much thought goes into something as simple as, like a chair in an airport to meet all these different needs.
Yeah, it really highlights just how complex designing effective public spaces can be and how much our behaviors are influenced by the environment, even in these places that we're just passing through.
So next time you're at the airport, take a second to look around, observe how you and other people are choosing seats, dealing with your bags. You'll probably start to notice some of these things that we've been talking about playing out in real time. And maybe it'll even make you think about other public spaces, like trains, parks, waiting rooms.
Yeah, I think a good thought experiment is just to think about that constant tension between what we need as individuals, space for our things, comfort, a good view, and what works best for the space as a whole, keeping things flowing, making sure the space is used efficiently. It's a really interesting dynamic to observe.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap it up for today. This has
Right.
been a fascinating deep dive into airport seating and all the complexities that come with it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.